This podcast is titled Questions About Genesis. There are people who have spent their entire lives answering the questions raised in the book of Genesis. And I must confess that a lot of those experts in Genesis come up with more convincing answers than I will. So when I have questions about the answers by experts, it's not that I feel I have better answers than the experts. Rather, I feel God has better answers than the experts. One time, the Christian rock and roller, Larry Norman, was told by a guy that he had been guided by God in writing a new song. Larry listened patiently to the song and then commented very quietly, "I thought God could write better music than that." And I'm sure God could. And God can give better answers to questions in Genesis than I can. I'm sure of that. But, well, you're kind of stuck with me for today. So these aren't the best answers in the world. To get those, you're going to have to check with God. So one question people often wonder about is whether creation took place in 24-hour days. The answer? Why, yes, of course. Unless they were 23-hour days or 22-hour days or even shorter days. It all depends. The world's spin has been slowing down bit by bit for a long time. But I hear you say, but did Jesus create the world in 7 days? And I think we can say without much of any question that no, he didn't. The Bible describes 6 days of creation and one for resting. Now, God didn't need that rest, but he wanted us to follow his example. So how long did it take for God to create the world? Exactly the amount of time that he intended. That's how long. I don't know how long it took because I wasn't there, even though some people think I'm that old. I'm not being a smart aleck, at least, well, maybe a little bit. I really don't know because the word yom, usually translated day, can mean almost any unit of time. So that's one question answered. So let's go on to question 2. Was Eve an afterthought? God trying to do a better job the second time around? No, she was in the plan from day one. Actually, she was in the plan from the very beginning of time, as was Adam, and you too. God planned you from the beginning as well. So that's 2 questions answered, and let's go on to question 3. Could God move on an object that was too big to be moved? You've probably heard that question before. Of course, God created the rules, and he can change them as well. He has more power than any law of physics or any geology or any mathematics or any kind of law at all. He makes decisions whether we know it or not, and we are self-deluded if we think otherwise. But now I'm beginning to sound like a simplistic, narrow-minded something or other. It doesn't matter what I sound like. What matters is who God is. And he is beyond us, far beyond anything that we can think of. And I'm glad about that, because God is always smarter than anyone else. Even me. Especially me. Next question. Did Joseph marry a woman who believed in sun worship? Well, probably. After all, her father was the chief priest of that religion. But I'm sure that Joseph asked about it. And God no doubt said, but I've got a wonderful plan for her life. Or something like that. Okay, next question. What about Joseph's divining cup? And I say, yeah. And you ask, was he really able to predict the future using that cup? And my answer is, only if God did the actual predicting. But it's a good question. Some questions only God can answer. Next question. Why didn't we hear more from Joseph's wife? My answer is perhaps because she was learning that there are better answers to questions than what I can come up with, speaking of herself. She may have been that kind of person. So he can answer the questions better than I can, always has been able to do that, and always will do that. Anyone, especially me, comes in a distant second to God in their answers. Talk to God. He will give you the answers, sooner or later. It may have something to do with Egyptians eating separately from the Israelites. People talk when they eat. I personally think she was trying to evangelize the Egyptians, just like Joseph was trying to evangelize her. Okay, last question for now. Why didn't Joseph and all his family return to Canaan, where they lived as nomads, instead of trying to find a home in Egypt? Now, I have an idea of why God wanted them to be nomads. Because, in a sense, we are all nomads, trying to find our true home. So, again, why did the Israelites stay so long in Egypt? They had been enculturated to Egypt. It seems like home to them. They might have gotten comfortable in Egypt, and it just looked like the best option. We can get too comfortable in our world as well. They might not have been able to imagine everything changing one day. They were comfortable in Egypt, but God doesn't call us to comfort and ease. God clearly planned for them to leave Egypt. See Genesis chapter 50, verse 24. But they preferred easy living. So God made things difficult because they weren't listening. Then, when the Israelites began begging to let them be free of Egypt, God made it possible. Not easy, but possible. It became hard to leave Egypt because they weren't listening to God earlier. When they became slaves in Egypt, they realized they needed to move. God has ways of showing us what is best and giving us the desire for that change. No more questions? Class is dismissed. This is Brother Don.